She was 21 years old. She had $6 left in a worn leather purse, a small trunk with 3 dresses, a locket, and a hammer wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom, and a one-way train ticket to a place she had never been handed to her that morning by a man who had decided she was no longer worth the expense. That was all she had. But she was standing in the doorway of a rusted iron boxcar on a dead-end siding in the Wyoming high country. And in her hand was a letter written 30 years ago by a man who had died alone in the dark. A man who had chosen truth over survival. A man whose last words named the exact person who had just put her on that train. She had paid $4 for this car. $4 at an auction where grown men laughed at her. $4 for a sealed iron box that nobody wanted sitting on a forgotten track in the middle of nowhere. Nobody knew what was inside. Nobody had known for 30 years. She knew now. And the man whose name was written in that letter, the man who had built an entire town, an entire empire on what was hidden in this car. He had no idea she was standing here. Not yet. Settle in. This is the story of Nell Voss. And the $4 that changed everything. Part 1. The girl who left the invoice on the desk. She was born knowing the weight of a hammer, not metaphorically, not as a lesson learned later in life, literally. From the time she was 4 years old, Nell Voss could walk into her father's smithy, close her eyes, and tell you by feel alone which hammer was which. The ball peen with its rounded face smooth and dense, the straight peen heavier toward the head, and her father's favorite, the small cross peen with the hickory handle worn dark by 20 years of sweat and oil and honest work. She knew them the way other girls knew their mother's voice. Her father, John Voss, was a railroad blacksmith, which meant he belonged in a sense to the railroad. He followed the work wherever the work went. New lines being laid across Wyoming, repair crews heading out to remote sidings after a hard winter. He went where the iron needed him, and he brought Nell along when he could. And when he couldn't, she waited in whatever town they were passing through and counted the days until he came back smelling of coal smoke and iron dust. She never minded the waiting, because when he came back, he always came back to the smithy. And the smithy was where she learned everything worth knowing. He didn't teach the way school teachers taught. No blackboard, no recitation. He taught with his hands and expected her hands to understand. "Hold it here," he'd say. "Not here on your palm, here at the base of your fingers. Feel the difference." She felt it. "Now watch the color." She watched. The steel in the forge moved through its shades the way a sky moves through a sunset. Dull black first, then a deep red like dried blood, then brighter, cherry red, then orange, then if you pushed it a yellow so pale it was almost white. Each color meant something. Each color was a message from the metal itself. "Too hot and you burn it," he told her. "Too cold and it won't move. You want it right in that middle place. That orange-yellow, that's when it talks to you." She was 6 years old, standing on a wooden crate to see over the forge edge, and she understood every word. He taught her the names of tools not as a list, but as a vocabulary. The hardy chisel that sat in the anvil's square hole waiting to cut. The swage block for shaping curves. The tongs and the difference between bolt tongs and V-bit tongs, and how using the wrong one could cost you a finger or worse. He taught her to read the temper of steel by its color. Straw yellow for springs and scrapers. Peacock blue for chisels. Dove gray for tools that needed to hold an edge without shattering. He taught her that metal had a grain like wood, and that working against the grain was a fool's errand. "Everything has a grain, Nell," he'd say, his voice low beneath the hiss of the slack tub. "Steel wood, people. You learn to work with it, not against it, and it will bend to your will. Fight it and it breaks. Or it breaks you." She was 10 when she first swung his cross-peen at a piece of hot iron on her own. He stood back and watched. Didn't hover, didn't help. She missed on the first swing. The hammer glanced off the edge of the billet, and the vibration ran up her arm like a struck bell. She repositioned, breathed, swung again. This time the face landed flat and true, and the iron moved exactly where she wanted it. Her father said nothing, just nodded once. The way men who work with their hands nod when something is done right. A small private acknowledgement that needed no words. That nod meant more to her than any compliment she received in her entire life. She carried it with her the way she carried the hammer, both of them invisible to the outside world, both of them heavier than they looked. When she was 17, the cough started. It was winter, a bad one even by Wyoming standards. John Voss had been working a repair detail on a mountain siding for 3 weeks, sleeping in a crew car with 12 other men, all of them breathing the same cold air in a space no bigger than a pantry. By the time he came back to town, the cough had settled into his chest like something that intended to stay. The doctor called it consumption. He was gone within the year. Nell stood at the grave in the hard December ground and felt the cold go right through her coat like it had always been there, like she had always been this cold and just hadn't noticed until now. She had the smithy. She had his tools. She had the hammer with the hickory handle, which she wrapped carefully in oilcloth and placed at the bottom of her trunk before anything else. That was what she had. Then Harlan Crest arrived. He came from the east, from a place called Crest's Hollow, a prosperous town that bore his name because he had built it more or less through what he described as shrewd investment and careful management of opportunity. He was John Voss's older brother, estranged in the way that some brothers become estranged, not through any single terrible event, but through years of quietly choosing different things. John had chosen iron and fire and craft. Harlan had chosen ledgers and land and the accumulation of things that didn't rust. They had not spoken in 11 years. Harlan arrived 2 days after the funeral. He was a tall man, thin in the way that certain men are thin, not from want but from discipline, as if he had decided that carrying extra weight was inefficient. He wore a good wool coat. He carried a leather satchel. He moved through the smithy the way a building inspector moves through a condemned property, taking careful note of everything while touching nothing. He looked at the forge, the anvil, the tool racks. He didn't look at Nell. "I'll have a man from the hardware come by Thursday," he said. "They'll take the equipment. The building itself I'll sell with the lot." Nell stood in the center of the smithy where she had stood 1,000 times before. The coals in the forge were still warm. Her father had banked them 4 weeks ago before he left for the mountain siding. She hadn't let them go cold since. She kept them going. She didn't know why. She just did. This was his living, she said. Harlan looked at her then. His eyes were gray. Not a warm gray, the gray of overcast sky before snow. "It was a poorly performing asset," he said. "The equipment is old. The building needs a new roof. Selling it now is the practical decision." He said it the way he would say the sky was pale, as simple fact, as the only reasonable interpretation of available information. She didn't argue. She understood already that argument was not a language Harlan Crest spoke. He took her back to Crest's Hollow with him. Not from warmth. He was not a warm man. He took her because she was 17, because she had nowhere else to go, and because leaving her to manage on her own would reflect poorly on him in the eyes of the town. She understood that too. The house in Crest's Hollow was large and quiet. 3 stories of painted clapboard on the main street close enough to the bank that Harlan could walk to work in 2 minutes, which he did every morning at 7:15 precisely. The house smelled of dry paper and beeswax and the particular stillness of rooms that are rarely used. She was given a small room on the 3rd floor. A bed, a dresser, a window that faced the back of the property and the neighboring fence. She was given meals. She was given a list of household tasks that rotated weekly. She was not given conversation, not really. Dinner each evening was a recitation of commerce, freight costs, interest rates, the price of timber in the eastern counties. Harlan spoke. His wife, a pale, tired woman named Edith, nodded at intervals. Nell sat and ate and listened and learned the grammar of a world built entirely on numbers. Harlan never mentioned John Voss, not once in 4 years. It was as if her father had been a footnote he had decided to omit from the final edition. One evening in her 2nd year there, Nell mentioned him, carefully. She said only that her father had told her something once about working with the grain of a thing rather than against it, and that she had been thinking about it. Harlan set down his fork, looked at her. Those gray eyes, steady and cool. "Your father," he said, "was a man who confused sentiment with value. He saw meaning in things that had no monetary worth. It made him a poor businessman, and in the end a poor provider." Silence. "There is no column in a balance sheet for sentiment, Nell. That is not a flaw in the balance sheet." He picked up his fork and continued eating. She didn't mention her father again, but she kept the hammer, wrapped in its oilcloth. At the bottom of her trunk, where Harlan's periodic dispassionate inventory of household possessions would never think to look. A thing of no monetary value. A thing whose only worth was in sentiment. Which meant by Harlan Crest's accounting, it was worth nothing. Which meant he never saw it at all. 4 years passed the way water passes over stone, slowly and without drama, but wearing something down. She turned 21 on a Tuesday in March. The morning was gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, the ground still frozen in the low places where the sun hadn't reached since November. She came downstairs at the usual time, set the table, made the coffee, put out the bread and the preserves. Harlan came down at 7:10, 5 minutes earlier than usual. He did not say happy birthday. He said, "Come to my office when you've finished your breakfast. There's a matter that needs to be settled." She already knew before she sat down that the coffee tasted different this morning. Or maybe the coffee was the same and she was different. Maybe the thing wearing down had finally worn through. She went to his office at 7:40. It was a room that smelled of leather and dry paper and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco from years ago. The desk was wide and oak and polished to a dark gleam. The bookshelves held ledgers, not books. Columns of figures behind leather spines. He was seated. He did not ask her to sit. On the desk, squared precisely before him, was a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the wood toward her. She looked at it. It was an invoice. Itemized. 4 years of food, clothing, lodging, the doctor visit in her second year, when she had a fever, the cost of her winter coat, a replacement pair of shoes. Every line had a date. Every line had a figure. The handwriting was neat and exact, the kind of handwriting that had spent a lifetime recording things that mattered. The total at the bottom was a number she had never seen applied to a human life before. Her life. The cost of her existence in his house for 4 years. She stood very still. "This is what your maintenance has cost this household," Harlan said. His voice was flat, administrative, the voice of a man closing a file. She looked at the number, felt the air leaving her lungs slowly like a forge fire going out. It was a debt she could never repay. Not in a year, not in 10 years, not on any wage she was likely to earn in any work available to her. It was a cage made of ink. "However," he said. He steepled his fingers. "I am prepared to forgive this debt in its entirety. In exchange, you will accept a train ticket to any destination west of here and a stipend of $10 for your relocation." He placed a ticket in 2 $5 bills beside the invoice. She stared at them. $10. 4 years. Her father's brother. Her father's name never spoken in this house. The forge sold for less than it was worth. The tools hauled away on a Thursday. This is not an offer, she understood. There was nothing in his posture that invited negotiation. No softness in those gray eyes. No memory of the brother who had taught a girl to read the color of hot steel. Just a man, closing an account. She picked up the ticket. She picked up the money. She looked at the invoice one more time, and she left it on the desk. She did not sign it. She did not take it. She simply turned and walked out of the office and up the stairs to her room and began to pack her trunk. The dresses first, then her mother's locket, then last and most careful the oilcloth bundle from the very bottom. The hammer, still heavy, still true. An hour later she was standing on the platform of the Crest's Hollow depot. The westbound train was already visible as a smear of black smoke against the pale sky, moving toward her with the slow inevitability of something that had been set in motion a long time ago and would not stop now. She did not look back at the town, at the painted clapboard, at the bank with Harlan's name on the window glass. The train arrived in a scream of steam and iron. She got on. She sat on a hard wooden bench with her trunk at her feet and watched Crest's Hollow disappear behind her. The neat streets, the fat cattle in the fenced pastures, the tidy farmhouses with their smoke-thread chimneys, all of it a monument to her uncle's particular vision of what the world was for. It got smaller. Then it was gone. The land changed as the train moved west, green becoming ochre, hills flattening into a high plain that seemed to have no end and no interest in having one. The air coming through the open window turned dry and thin and smelled of sage and distance. The other passengers thinned out at each stop. Men with sunburned necks heading back to homesteads. A woman with 2 children who got off at a town that was really just a water tower and a hardware store. A drummer with a sample case who fell asleep somewhere past the 3rd hour and began to snore with tremendous commitment. By the afternoon of the 2nd day, the car was nearly empty, and the landscape outside was a vast, pale emptiness under a sky that pressed down on everything like a hand. She had $6 left. She'd spent $4 already on food from the station vendors, and she would not reach Rollins the end of her ticket for another full day. She was calculating. The way her father had taught her to calculate things not in numbers exactly, but in weight and balance, and what a thing could actually bear. $6. No family. No trade she could sell in a town that didn't know her. No reference. No connections. No plan beyond arriving somewhere and figuring it out from there. $6 and a hammer, and the absolute bedrock conviction that she was not, under any circumstances, going to give Harlan Crest the satisfaction of being right about her. That was the asset column. Not much, but not nothing. She was staring out the window at the pale emptiness when she heard the conductor and the brakeman talking in the vestibule between cars. She wasn't trying to listen. But the car was quiet, and they were not particularly quiet men. "Sulphur Bend Spur," the brakeman was saying. "You remember that old dead-end line?" "I remember the auctions Thursday," the conductor said. "Somebody's got to clear that equipment before winter." "What's left out there worth clearing?" "Rusted rails, couple of flat cars full of rot, tender with the fittings stripped." A pause. A sound of something being shuffled. "Oh, and that sealed car, the B40. Been sitting there since before either of us was working this line." "They know what's in it." "Nobody knows what's in it. That's the thing. Lot description just says contents unknown. Company tried to open it once back in '61, but there was some kind of legal complication." "What kind?" "The injunction kind." The conductor's voice had a particular flatness that suggested he had learned somewhere along the way not to ask further questions about injunctions. A pause. "Cheaper to auction the whole mess than haul it out," the brakeman said. That's what they figured. Nell sat very still. Contents unknown. Legal complication in 1861. Sealed since before either of us was working this line. She was calculating again. Different numbers this time. An auction. A sealed car no one wanted. Whatever was inside had been there long enough that the railroad had stopped caring about it. Long enough that someone with a legal instrument had once felt it necessary to keep it closed. Those two facts did not fit together naturally. You don't need an injunction to protect a car full of nothing. The train slowed for a water stop at a junction with no name. Just a tower and a telegraph shed and a dirt road going nowhere in both directions. She stood up. The conductor looked at her when she appeared at the vestibule door. "I'd like to get off at Sulphur Bend Spur," she said. He looked at her dress, her trunk, the complete absence of anyone waiting for her in any direction. "There's nothing there, miss." "I'm aware." She held his gaze. "I'm meeting someone." She was not meeting anyone. She had no one to meet anywhere. But the lie came out steady and clean the way a clean cut comes from a sharp chisel, and he accepted it the way people accept things that are stated with sufficient confidence. He shrugged, pulled the signal cord. The train groaned and hissed to a stop beside a weed-choked siding. A sign, its paint mostly gone, tilted slightly on its post. Sulphur Bend Spur. The brakeman swung her trunk down onto the hardpan. The train sighed and began to move again, gathering itself, and within 2 minutes the sound of it had faded into the sage-scented wind, and she was alone. Truly, completely alone. The silence of the high plains is not like any other silence. It has weight to it, presence, as if the land itself is paying close attention to whatever has the nerve to stand on it. Nell stood in it for a moment, then she picked up her trunk and walked toward the buildings. Sulphur Bend was not a ghost town. Not exactly. A ghost town has the memory of what it used to be. Sulphur Bend felt more like the sketch of a town that had never been fully drawn in, a dozen sun-bleached structures grouped together with the particular desperation of things that have no shelter except each other. A general store with its windows boarded, a livery whose roof had folded in on itself, 4 or 5 saltbox houses in varying stages of returning to the earth. And at the end of the spur line, in a flat, dusty yard, an auction in progress. 20 men, maybe. Ranchers with sun-cracked faces, Scavengers with wagons already half-loaded with salvage. A tired-looking auctioneer in a sweat-stained hat working his way down a line of items that nobody seemed particularly excited about. "Sold for $3.50 to the gentleman in blue." The gavel came down on a pile of rusted rail. Moving along, Nell walked toward the group, her trunk in one hand, feeling the particular weight of being the only woman in a place where women were not expected. She had felt that weight before. In the smithy, when railroad men came in and looked past her to find her father, she had learned to let it settle and then ignore it the way you ignore a fly when you're trying to read the color of hot steel. She looked at the items up for sale. Flat cars loaded with lumber so rotted it had gone soft. A tender car stripped down to bare iron. A hand pump, miscellaneous track hardware in a heap, and at the very end of the line, the car. It was larger than she'd expected. A Class B 40 baggage car built heavy, the way railroad equipment was built in the 50s. Oak framing reinforced with iron plating, the whole thing designed to last decades and mostly having succeeded. The paint that remained was a faded rust red, the ghost of what had once been a proud company crimson. The door was not just locked, it was sealed. A weld bead ran along the seam between the door and the frame, thick and crude, the work of someone who had been less concerned with aesthetics than with permanence. Iron laid over iron meant to stay. Beside the door, tacked to the wood, was a brittle square of paper. The lot description, Lot 61. One Class B 40 baggage car, contents unknown, sold as is where is, buyer responsible for removal. The auctioneer reached it eventually. He barely paused. "All right, Lot 61, sealed baggage car. We don't know what's in it. Probably 30 years of dust. Can't open it, won't try. Starting at $5. Anybody?" Silence. The men looked at the car, then at each other. The math was obvious to all of them. The cost of cutting it open, hauling it out, scrapping the iron, more trouble than whatever scrap value it had. $4, the auctioneer tried. His voice had the particular weariness of a man who has been standing in the sun too long trying to sell things that don't want to be sold. He swept the small crowd. His gaze landed on Nell. She raised her hand. $4, she said, clearly, without hesitation. Someone laughed, low and quick. A couple of others smiled. The auctioneer's eyebrows went up, then came down. He'd seen stranger things. $4 from the lady. Do I hear $4.50? He looked around. Nothing. 4 once, 4 twice. The gavel fell. Sold for $4. Congratulations, miss. She's yours soon as you figure out how to move her. More laughter. Easy laughter. The kind that doesn't mean anything except that men in a group find certain things amusing. Nell walked to the table, counted out $4 from her purse, accepted the handwritten bill of sale, turned and walked back to the car. $6 left. No plan, no tools, no one. She put her hand flat against the iron side of the car. It was warm from the sun, almost hot. She could feel the faint roughness of old rust beneath her palm, and beneath that the solid, unyielding weight of the iron itself. She owned something. It was not much. It was possibly the least practical purchase ever made by any person in the history of Wyoming, but it was hers, and no one could put a number on it and slide it across a desk and tell her the account was closed. She stood there for a moment just feeling the warmth of it. Then she heard footsteps in the dust behind her and turned. He was old. 70, maybe more. A back bent by decades of labor into a shape that suggested the labor was ongoing, even when he was standing still. His hands were remarkable, large, gnarled at every joint, the kind of hands that have been tools so long they've started to look like them. His eyes were pale blue and sharp in a way that suggested his back was the only part of him that had aged at the expected rate. "Saw you at the auction," he said. His voice was a rasp like a file on rough iron. "I imagine most people did," Nell said. Clem Purdy. He didn't offer the gnarled hand. Seemed to know it would be uncomfortable. Worked this spur line when it was still running. Back in the 50s. Gandy dancer, then crew foreman on the 2nd mile. Live in that shack behind the livery now. A pause. Railroad pension. Barely, but barely is enough. Nell Voss. He looked at the car, then at her. "You bought yourself a puzzle," he said. "I did." You aim to open it. I do. He chewed on something. Nothing visible. Just an internal negotiation happening behind those sharp, pale eyes. There's a thing you should know about that car, he said finally. The railroad sent men to open it in 1861, 6 years after it was sealed, a crew with cutting tools and a supervisor with orders from the main office. He paused. A company lawyer met them here with a federal injunction before they got the door off, sent them all home. Nell looked at him. Someone filed that injunction, she said. Someone powerful, Clem said. Someone who was still connected enough to the railroad in 61 to know the moment an opening crew got scheduled and connected enough to the courts to stop them before they arrived. And after 61, the railroad started having its own troubles. Ownership changed hands. The spur line was officially decommissioned in 63. New management had new problems and old sealed cars on dead-end sidings weren't among them. He looked at the car again. It's just sat here since, 22 years. Nobody asking. Until now. Until a girl with $4 asked. He almost smiled. Not quite. I got a sledgehammer and a set of chisels. Belonged to the old crew boss. Left them in my shack when the spur closed. He stopped talking. She waited. You can use them, he said. If you'll share whatever's in there. If it's anything more than spiders. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. Agreed, she said. Finding shelter was the next order. She explored the derelict buildings until she found one that was more intact than destroyed, a small boarding house called the Sulphur Rest, its sign faded to near illegibility. One room at the back still had its window glass, an iron bed frame, a wood stove with a pipe that was rusted but whole. She found a functioning hand pump behind the building. The water came up cold and clean, tasting of iron and deep earth. She slept in the boarding house that night with her trunk against the door and her father's hammer within reach. Not from fear exactly, but from the same instinct that keeps a coal banked overnight. Just in case. In the morning, Clem Purdy arrived at the car at first light with a 12-pound sledgehammer over one shoulder and a canvas roll under his arm. He set them down and unrolled the canvas to show a set of heavy steel chisels, their edges dulled by years of disuse, but the steel itself still sound. He looked at her. She was already building a fire in the small portable brazier she'd found in the boarding house basement. She had coals going, tongs heating. He watched her work for a moment. You've held a hammer before, he said. My father was a blacksmith. He nodded, just once. The way men who work with their hands nod when they recognize something. She took the dullest chisel and held it in the coals until the tip glowed cherry red. Then she drew it out, set it on the anvil fragment she'd scavenged from the livery ruins, and began to work the edge with her father's crosspeen. Careful strokes, each one placed, each one purposeful. The edge came back. When she was satisfied with the angle, she handed the chisel to Clem. We go after the weld, she said, not the door itself. The weld is the weak point. He looked at the car, then at the chisel, then at her. Your father teach you that. He taught me everything has a grain, she said. You find it, then you work with it. He took the chisel, positioned it against the weld bead. She took the sledge. The first blow rang out across the empty plain like a struck bell. 3 days of work. 3 days of the sledge and chisel and the fire and the ringing clang that echoed off the sage-covered hills. 3 days of blistered hands and aching shoulders, and evenings sitting by the stove in the boarding house, eating whatever Agnes Foley, the gray-haired woman who had appeared on the second morning with a pot of beans and a no-nonsense expression, decided to bring. Agnes was a widow. She had lived at Sulphur Bend for 15 years in the house at the far edge of town. She had stayed when everyone else left, she explained, because she had nowhere particular to go, and the rent was effectively nothing. She didn't ask many questions. She looked at Nell the way a woman looks at another woman doing something difficult and decides without ceremony that she is going to be useful. On the second evening, Agnes brought coffee and the information that she had known several of the men who had worked the spur line. Back in its running days. Good men, she said. They'd built something real. Then the railroad pulled out, and they'd gone away with nothing, and some of them had never recovered from it. Nell listened, filed it away. On the fourth day, with Clem on the sledge and Nell holding the chisel steady against the last section of weld, there was a sound different from all the sounds that had come before. A crack. Not the sharp percussive crack of metal being struck, but a deeper, slower crack. The sound of something giving way that has been holding for 30 years. A line of darkness appeared at the seam. They looked at it. Then Clem went for the pry bar they'd found in the general store and worked it into the gap and leaned his whole bent body into it, and the door of the B-40 baggage car screamed a long, tortured metal shriek that probably carried a mile in the still air. And then it moved. Slowly. Then all at once. The door slid open and a wave of air came out of the darkness. Air that had been sealed in since 1855. It smelled of dry rot and dust and something else beneath those things. Something faint and metallic. They stood back and let it breathe for a while. Then Clem lit the lantern and held it up, and they looked inside. Wooden crates stacked and bound with iron straps. A long canvas roll that might have been tools. And there, bolted to the floor at the center of the car, a large iron strongbox. Its surface covered in the fine gray dust of 30 years of nothing. And beside the strongbox, the skeleton. He was dressed in what remained of a railroad uniform. The fabric had mostly surrendered to time, but enough remained to show the particular cut of it. An official uniform. A man of some position. One hand rested on the strongbox lid, the fingers still loosely curved as if the gesture of protection had outlasted everything else. Clem took his hat off, set it against his chest. They stood in silence for a moment. Nell did not look away from the skeleton. She looked at him the way her father had taught her to look at a piece of iron in the forge, reading it, understanding what it was telling her. This man had known he was going to die in here. He had locked the door, welded it shut from the inside. She could see now the small portable forge unit among the tool crates still in place. He had sealed himself in with the strongbox and whatever was in it, and he had stayed. She stepped carefully into the car, her boots stirring the ancient dust, crouched beside the skeleton. And there, near the other hand, the one not resting on the box, half hidden under a fold of disintegrated fabric, was a book. Small, bound in dark leather, its cover dry and cracked as old skin. She picked it up, opened it. The first page in a neat, careful hand. Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. Payroll manifest and transaction record. August 1855. Paymaster August Merritt. She turned pages, lists of names, towns, figures, wages owed to men who had built a railroad line across this high plain. Foremen, engineers, brakemen, blacksmiths. Hundreds of entries in that same careful hand, each one precise, each one a record of a life's work in numbers. At the back of the ledger, tucked into the inside cover, was an envelope. The paper had yellowed to the color of old bone. The wax seal was still intact. And written across the front in that same neat hand were 8 words. To whoever finds this, God willing you are not one of his people. Nell sat in the dust of the car with the ledger in her lap and the envelope in her hands. Clem stood in the doorway with the lantern, not speaking. She broke the seal. The letter inside was 3 pages. The handwriting was the same careful script as the ledger entries, but slightly less regular toward the end. The hand of a man writing in difficult circumstances. August Merritt, Paymaster, Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. Writing this on the night of August 14th, 1855, having been sealed inside baggage car B-40 on the Sulphur Bend Spur for 2 days. She read slowly. Clem stayed in the doorway. Agnes, who had arrived with coffee at some point during the cutting and had never entirely left, appeared now at the edge of the opening and stood very still. Merritt wrote about the night of August 12th, the payroll train, the shipment of wages for the Central Division of the Wyoming and Pacific, enough money to pay hundreds of workers for a full season of hard labor. The train had been stopped on the Sulphur Bend Spur by masked men, but Merritt had grown suspicious before the stop. Too convenient. The location too perfectly isolated. The timing too precisely known. He had locked himself in the baggage car. And when the robbery began outside, he had listened. He had a good ear for voices. A professional asset for a man whose job required him to keep careful account of who said what about money. He recognized the voice of the man in charge. He wrote the name carefully as if taking testimony. Harlan Crest, Vice President of Land Acquisition for the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. He wrote what he understood of the scheme. Harlan had orchestrated the theft to acquire, using the stolen capital, the land made newly valuable by the railroad's own expansion. Land that the railroad itself should have purchased, would have purchased, if it hadn't suddenly found itself unable to account for its payroll funds. He would bankrupt the company from the inside, acquire its most valuable assets at distress prices, and walk away having built an empire on the labor of men who would never be paid. Merritt wrote that he had sealed himself in because he knew what would happen to him if they got the door open. He wrote that he had tried to seal the door from the inside using tools from the supply crates because he understood that his survival was irrelevant. What mattered was that the ledger survive. In his final page, which was harder to read, the handwriting changing as the air inside the car thinned, he wrote his last request. See that the men are paid. See that justice is done. The proof of the scheme is in the discrepancies between the official company books and the manifest I carry. The truth is here. I put it here. Do not let it stay buried. Nell sat in the dust with the letter in her hands. Outside the open door, the Wyoming plains stretched away to the mountains in the late afternoon light. She thought about a man in a gray suit with cold eyes sitting behind an oak desk. An invoice squared on the polished wood. 4 years of her life reduced to a column of figures. She thought about a forge sold for less than it was worth. Tools hauled away on a Thursday. A name never spoken at a dinner table for 4 years. She thought about her father's hand around the hickory handle of the crosspeen worn dark with sweat and oil and honest work. Everything has a grain, Nell. You learn to work with it, not against it. She looked at the letter, the ledger, the strong box. Then she looked at the name written in August Merritt's careful hand, Harlan Crest. She was not surprised. That was the thing she noticed first when she checked herself. She was not surprised. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases, placed it back in the envelope, placed the envelope back in the ledger, stood up and walked to the doorway of the car. Clem was looking at her with those sharp, pale eyes. Agnes was very still. Nell looked out at the empty plain, the pale sky, the far mountains going purple in the fading light. You need to hear this, she said. Both of you. Part 2. What 30 years buried. The letter sat on the table between them like a lit fuse. Clem read it twice. Didn't speak the first time. Just turned the pages with those gnarled hands, his pale eyes moving line by line with the careful attention of a man who had spent a lifetime reading things that mattered. Agnes read it once and set it down and stood at the window looking out at the dark plain with her arms crossed and her jaw set like a woman deciding something. Nell watched them both. She had already finished deciding. We go to the sheriff, Clem said. Finally. Which sheriff? Nell said. Not a question. He thought about it. Territorial Marshal, then. Cheyenne. Harlan Crest has been doing business in Cheyenne for 20 years, Nell said. He has a bank, he has lawyers, he has land deeds and court filings and 30 years of paper going back in every direction. She paused. I have $6, a dead man's letter, and a bill of sale for a boxcar. Silence. The newspapers, Agnes said without turning from the window. Same problem, Nell said. A 21-year-old girl walks into a newspaper office in Cheyenne with a story about one of the territory's most prominent bankers. They print it, and he sues. They don't print it, and nothing changes. Agnes turned then, her eyes sharp and dark and considering. Then what? She said. Nell put her hand on the ledger. We do what August Merritt asked, she said. We see that the men are paid. Clem looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. A language he recognized but hadn't expected in this context. Most of those men are dead, he said. Their families aren't. Nell opened the ledger to a page near the middle, ran her finger down the careful columns. Merritt didn't just record names. He recorded hometowns, where each man came from, and look here. She turned the ledger toward them. Thomas Hess, foreman 2nd mile, home listed as Sulphur Bend, Wyoming. Agnes went very still. The Hess place, she said quietly, out on the east side of the valley. Abandoned now, but his granddaughter Clara still lives in the valley, over by Draper Creek. She does seamstress work. Widow. 2 boys. Nell looked at her. You know her. I know everyone, Agnes said. It wasn't boastful, just accurate. Nell closed the ledger. Then we start with Clara Hess. Clem looked at the strongbox, which they had spent another half-day opening the hinges as Nell had correctly identified being the weakness rather than the lock. Inside, in velvet-lined compartments that had somehow kept their shape across 3 decades, were stacks of gold coins, double eagles, still bright, still exact. The full payroll for the Central Division of the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad, August 1855. A fortune, sitting in an iron box in a dead spur town waiting 30 years for someone to ask the right question. "You're not going to keep any of it," Clem said. It was not quite a question. "I'm going to keep what was owed to my father," Nell said, "when I find his name." She hadn't found it yet. She'd been through half the ledger, not there yet, but she knew it would be. The same way she'd known the car wasn't just forgotten, the same way she'd known sitting in Harlan's office with that invoice in front of her, that the number on the page was not the truth about what she was worth. Some things you know in the bones before the mind catches up. The next morning, Nell and Clem borrowed Agnes's wagon, a sturdy two-horse affair that Agnes drove herself, as it turned out, because Agnes had decided she was coming, and that was simply that, and they drove the east road along the valley floor as the sun came up over the mountains. Clara Hess's place was small, well kept in the particular way of a woman who has very little and takes very good care of what she has. A whitewashed fence freshly done. A kitchen garden still producing late-season greens. Curtains in the windows that matched. She answered the door herself. She was in her early 40s, dark hair going gray at the temples, hands that showed the work she did roughened at the fingertips from years of needle and thread, eyes that were guarded in the practiced way of someone who has learned to expect that unexpected visitors usually want something from you. She looked at the three of them on her porch. The old bent man, the gray-haired widow, the young woman in a plain dress with a leather-bound book under her arm. "Mrs. Hess," Nell said, "my name is Nell Voss. We've come on behalf of the Wyoming and Pacific Railroad to settle a debt owed to your grandfather Thomas Hess for his service as foreman during the summer of 1855. Clara stared at her, blinked. "The railroad went bankrupt," she said. "That was the story told," Nell said carefully. "But the payroll was not stolen, Mrs. Hess. It was misplaced. For 30 years. She opened the ledger and held it out. "Your grandfather's name is on page 14. 31 weeks of work at $6 a week. $186. Clara looked at the ledger, at her grandfather's name written in that neat, careful hand. Thomas Hess, foreman, 186.00. Her face did something complicated. "My grandmother said they were cheated," she said. Her voice had gone quiet. "She said it until the day she died. People in town told her she was wrong, that the railroad just failed, that there was no money to pay anyone." She looked up. She never believed them. "She was right," Nell said. She placed a small canvas bag on the porch railing between them. "That is $186 for the original wages," she said, "plus 30 years of calculated interest compounded annually." She had spent 2 nights working that figure, her father's habits of precision sitting in her hands as naturally as they ever had. "The total is in the bag. I'd ask you to count it and sign a receipt." Clara's hands moved to the bag before she seemed to decide to move them. She opened it, looked inside. Then she sat down on her own porch step. Just sat down right there like her legs had made a decision independent of the rest of her. The tears came quietly, not dramatic, just present. The way tears come when something you've held for a very long time is finally set down. "He always said," she whispered, "he always said they were cheated. My grandmother. She died believing it, but never being able to prove it." "She was right," Nell said again. "And so was he." Clara signed the receipt with a steady hand. Nell filed it carefully in the back of the ledger. One name crossed off. One line settled. One woman's family told the truth that had been owed to them for 30 years. They drove back to Sulphur Bend in the long afternoon light, the wagon wheels leaving twin tracks in the dust of the valley road. Agnes didn't say much on the drive back, but somewhere past the halfway point she reached over and put her hand briefly on Nell's arm, just for a moment, just the weight of it. Nell kept her eyes on the road. They found the others one by one. The ledger was the map. Merritt's careful entries gave them names and hometowns, and in some cases family notes in the margins married 3 children homestead at such and such creek. As if he had known writing those entries that someone might one day need exactly this information to find the people owed. Or maybe he was just a thorough man. Some people are. The world tends not to reward it. News traveled ahead of them, the way news travels in small communities, not by announcement, but by the particular velocity of things that matter. A freighter who had been at Clara Hess's the afternoon after their visit carried the story to a feed store 2 valleys over. The feed store owner's wife carried it to her sister. By the time Nell and Clem arrived at the homestead of a man named Rufus Garland, grandson of a brakeman named William Garland, wages owed $48, Rufus had already heard something. He was standing in his yard when they arrived, arms crossed, watching them come up the road. "You the woman paying railroad debts?" he said when they got close enough. "I am," Nell said. "My grandfather's name is in that book. William Garland, page 9. He uncrossed his arms, signed the receipt without being asked to explain it twice. Then there was the daughter of a surveyor who was running a small bakery in a town called Holt, 15 miles south. The nephew of a stonecutter who had become a bootmaker and wept silently when Nell showed him his uncle's name in the ledger. The granddaughter of an engineer who had never spoken of the railroad because the memory was too bitter, who listened to Nell's explanation, with her hands clasped tight in her lap, and then stood up and said quietly, but very clearly, that she had always known her grandfather was a man of integrity, and she was grateful someone had thought to say so. Not one of them asked where the money had come from, or not in a way that required a direct answer. They understood in the way that people who have been wronged understand such things, that the full story would take time to tell completely. And they were owed the money first. The story could wait. Each receipt went into the ledger, the stack growing, patient, undeniable. Back in Sulphur Bend, things were beginning to change in the way that things change when a little water finds a dry place. Slowly, then faster than you expected. Owen Hatch, 24 years old, son of Silas Hatch, who was listed on page 6 of the ledger as a blacksmith's assistant, wages owed $62, had taken his payment and bought a shipment of iron and coal from the hardware supplier in the next town. He had cleared the debris from the old smithy building at the edge of Sulphur Bend, swept the floor, built a new chimney from salvaged brick. The ring of a hammer on an anvil had come back to the valley for the first time in 20 years. Nell heard it on her 3rd morning there, standing at the door of the B-40 car, her home now, or the beginning of one. Clem and Owen had been working on it all week, cut 2 windows into the thick iron walls, laid a proper pine floor over the iron base, built a small efficient stove in the corner. The car that had been a sealed tomb was becoming something else, a place, her place. She set her father's cross-peen hammer on the plank desk Clem had built for her. It sat on a stack of receipts like a paperweight, a tool repurposed. Her father would have appreciated the economy of that. She was working through the ledger, systematically cross-referencing the names against Agnes's encyclopedic knowledge of who had stayed in the valley and who had gone where. Agnes would come in the mornings with coffee and information. She knew things about people in a 30-mile radius with the specificity of a woman who had paid attention for a long time. "The Mercer family," Agnes said one morning, settling into the chair across from Nell's desk. "James Mercer listed on your page 11. His son moved to Casper after the spur closed. Married a woman named Dorothea. They have 3 daughters. The eldest, Prudence, teaches school in Casper. She could receive payment on behalf of the family." "You know all this from memory," Nell said. "I've lived here 15 years, Agnes said. "I talk to freight haulers. I read what letters get left at the old store box. And I have very good recall." A small pause. "Also, I find people interesting, which helps." Nell looked at her. "What do you get from this?" she asked. Agnes considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I was here," she said finally, "when the spur closed. I watched people pack their things and leave, and I watched this valley go quiet. I watched it go from a place where children ran in the street to a place where nothing ran at all. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, but I never stopped being angry about it." She looked at the ledger. "Now I have something to do with that anger. That's enough for me." Nell nodded. They worked. 31 days after she had stepped off the train at Sulphur Bend with $6 in her purse, 24 families had been found, 19 payments made, the receipts stacking up in the back of the ledger like a slow-built wall. Word was spreading further than the valley now. Freight haulers carried it east on the main road. A traveling preacher mentioned it in his circuit sermon 50 miles away. Small items, small movements, but they accumulated. the way water accumulates behind a dam, quietly, with increasing weight. She was working late one evening when she heard it. Hoofbeats. A single horse moving at an unhurried pace up the road toward Sulphur Bend. She looked up from the ledger. The light outside was failing the sky that deep blue that comes just before full dark. She didn't go to the door. She waited. The knock came 10 minutes later. The man at the door was not anyone she recognized. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a way that didn't quite belong out here, wool coat too fine for this, dust boots too recently polished. He had a careful face, the face of a man who had learned to say things that meant something else. "Miss Voss," he said. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. "Yes," she said. "My name is Aldous Pruitt." He paused in the practiced way of someone giving you time to recognize a name that is supposed to mean something. "I represent certain interests that have been following recent events in this area with considerable attention." "Certain interests." "What interests?" she said. "Private ones." A small, calibrated smile. "I've been authorized to make you a very straightforward offer, Miss Voss. The ledger you currently possess, along with any copies that may exist, and the receipts you've collected, and your ongoing silence regarding the historical matters the ledger touches on." He paused. "In exchange, a sum that would ensure your comfort for the remainder of your life, permanently, without condition." He named the figure. It was large, genuinely large. The kind of number that solved every practical problem a 21-year-old woman without family or property or prospects might have for the next 50 years. Nell looked at him. He had good posture, the posture of a man accustomed to offers being accepted. "Who sent you?" she said. "I'm not at liberty." "Who sent you?" He adjusted his posture slightly, just slightly. "I represent a private party with significant interest in the resolution of a matter that could, if handled poorly, cause considerable disruption to a number of legitimate business operations in this territory." Nell thought about Harlan Crest, sitting behind his oak desk. The invoice squared perfectly on the polished wood. The flat gray eyes. The voice that said things like, "Your maintenance has cost this household as if a human life were a line item in a supply ledger." She thought about August Merritt alone in the dark, writing in a thinning air. She thought about Clara Hess sitting down on her own porch step because the weight of 30 years of truth being finally spoken was too much to take standing up. "No," Nell said. Pruitt looked at her. The calibrated smile remained in place, but something behind it shifted. "Miss Voss, I would encourage you to consider—" "No." She kept her voice level. "The answer is no. Tonight and any night you come back with a different number." He looked at the desk, at the ledger, at the stack of receipts beside it, at the hammer sitting on top. He looked at her one more time. "You should understand," he said quietly, "that refusing this offer changes the nature of the situation considerably." "I understand," she said. "Good night, Mr. Pruitt." He left. She stood in the doorway of the car and watched his horse move back down the road in the dark. Listened until the hoofbeats faded into the sage and the silence. Then she went inside, moved the ledger to the false floor she and Clem had built beneath the pine boards, a space Clem had lined with tin to protect against moisture, and now apparently other things. She placed the receipts with it. She did not sleep well that night. 3 nights later, she woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke. The wrong kind of smoke. Sharp and chemical. The smell of something burning that was not meant to burn. She was out of her blankets and at the door in seconds, pushed it open and the heat hit her face before the light did. Orange. Unsteady. Coming from the south end of the car where the exterior oak cladding was oldest and driest. Fire. She grabbed the bucket she kept by the stove, filled it from the barrel outside, threw it at the flames, filled it again. By the time Clem arrived, he slept light. He said later, a habit from 50 years of crew camps. The fire was at the base of the south exterior wall, fed by something that smelled of coal oil. Not accidental. Designed. Designed to destroy what was inside. But what was inside was not inside. The ledger was under the floor. The receipts were with it. The tin-lined space had done its work. They put the fire out between them, Clem and Nell and Owen, who appeared at a dead run with a horse trough bucket. The exterior wall was damaged, the oak cladding on the south end charred and ruined, but the iron plating beneath it was untouched, and the interior, the floor, the desk, the stove was intact. Nell stood in the dark after it was out, her hands black with ash, her eyes burning from the smoke. She looked at the char on the south wall. Someone had known exactly what they were trying to destroy, and they had failed, because she had moved it 3 days ago, because she had known since the moment Prewitt walked away with that small shift behind his smile that the offer was not the last move. She hadn't been sure what the next one would be, but she'd been sure there would be one. Some things you know in the bones. Clem was watching her from across the yard, his pale eyes reading her the way she'd taught him to read a piece of iron in the forge, checking the temperature, checking the grain. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." She looked at the charred wall. 5 copies, she said. "We need 5 copies of the ledger, in 5 different places." He nodded, already understood. "I'll get paper from Agnes in the morning," he said. They spent the next 4 days copying, Nell and Agnes and Clem taking shifts at the desk, the original ledger open beside them, reproducing every page in careful longhand, every name, every figure, every note in August Merritt's margins. The letter too copied word for word, 5 copies. One to Clara Hess, who had a locked cedar box and the kind of quiet determination that suggested she would sooner burn down her own house than let anyone take something entrusted to her. One to the traveling preacher who had mentioned Sulphur Bend in his circuit sermon. Agnes wrote him a letter and sent it with the copy, asking him to keep it safe and speak of it when his conscience moved him. One to a lawyer in the town of Rawlins. Agnes knew of him, described him as a man who had twice taken cases against railroad interests and lost but kept his name clean. She wrote him as well, outlining the situation in her precise, practical way. One buried under the floorboards of the boarding house, and one kept by Nell. Not under the false floor this time. She wore it folded inside her dress against her skin. The copy of the letter pressed flat between her and the world. Let them come back. Let them try again. The original stayed in the tin-lined floor space, the place they had not found, the place they had not known to look. When the 5 copies were done, she felt the shape of things shift slightly, like a piece of iron that has been heated properly and is now ready to be worked, the grain aligned, the temperature right. She was not safe. She understood that. But she was not alone, and the truth was distributed now in enough directions that destroying it had become effectively impossible. Not difficult. Impossible. There is a difference. She went back to the ledger payments. Pages 17 through 22, names she hadn't gotten to yet, families Agnes hadn't located yet, a widower in a town called Birch Fork, a set of brothers, heirs of a Gandy dancer named Pell, who Agnes believed were running a cattle operation up in the northern part of the territory. The work continued. It was on the 42nd day that Nell found the name. She had been through the ledger 4 times by then, organized the payments by family location, cross-referenced. She knew the pages well enough that she could have recited most of them, which was perhaps why she had missed it. The human eye skips over things it has seen too many times. She was copying a section for the 3rd version of the reference document she was building when her hand stopped. The pen stopped. She looked at the entry. John Voss. Blacksmith. Grade 2. Sulphur Bend Spur Construction Detail. May through August 1855. Wages owed $210. She read it again, and again. John Voss. Her father. He had been here. He had worked this line. He had swung a hammer on this exact spur, on this same hardpan ground in the summer of the year August Merritt died to protect a truth that included his name. He had been owed $210. And Harlan Crest had taken it, along with everything else he had taken from John Voss. The forge sold cheap, the house sold, the tools hauled away, and before all of that, the wages from the summer, he built a railroad that would make his own brother rich. Her father had never known. She was certain of that. He would have said something. He was not a man who swallowed things quietly. If he had known that Harlan had stolen his wages, had destroyed the company that owed them, had built a fortune on money that included John Voss's summer labor, he would have said something. He hadn't known. He had just gone on being John Voss, fixing things, teaching his daughter the color of hot steel, dying in a cold bunkhouse with nothing to pass on but a hammer and a philosophy and the way light looks when it hits metal at exactly the right angle. Nell sat at the desk for a long time. The lamp burned low. Outside the window, the sulfur-bend night was doing what it always did, pressing close and quiet and enormous, the stars absurdly bright above the empty plain. She put her finger on her father's name. The ink was 30 years old. The paper was dry and faintly foxed at the corners. But the letters were clear and exact and unmistakably there. John Voss. She thought about Harlan's face when she had left his house that morning. The invoice left on the desk. Those gray eyes watching her take the money and the ticket and go. No expression. No flicker of anything. He had known, she thought now. He had known her father's name was in that ledger. He had known that what was in the B-40 car was not just stolen wages but evidence of what he had done to his own brother. That was why the car had stayed sealed. That was why the injunction in 1861, not just to protect his theft from the railroad workers, to protect it from the possibility that someone who had reason to care would one day find it. He had looked at her across that desk with those gray flat eyes and calculated the risk of her and decided she was manageable. A girl, 21. No money, no connections, no plan. Put her on a train going west and the problem was solved. He hadn't known about the auction. He hadn't known she would get off the train. He hadn't known about $4 in a locked iron box that nobody wanted. She sat with her father's name under her finger until the lamp guttered and went out. In the dark, she could still see it, the shape of it behind her eyes, the same way she could still see the face of hot steel after she turned away from the forge. John Voss. Wages owed. Not forgotten. Not by her. She picked up her father's hammer from the desk, the hickory handle smooth and dark in her hand. The familiar weight of it, the way it balanced the small corrective pull it made against her palm that had always felt like his hand adjusting her grip. She held it for a while in the dark. Then she set it back down and lit the lamp again and went back to work. Because there were still names in the ledger she hadn't gotten to. Because the job was not done. Because $210 was the last entry in the column that needed closing and she was not going to close it until every other name had been settled first. That was the order of things. That was the grain of it. Her father had taught her you finish what you start. You don't rush the last step because it's the one you want most. You do it right or you do it again. She turned to page 23. Kept working. Part 3. What the debtor owed. He came on a Thursday. No announcement. No letter ahead of him. No lawyer this time and no hired man with a careful face and a calibrated smile. Just a single horse moving up the valley road in the early morning light, its rider sitting straight in the saddle the way men sit when they are trying to project certainty they do not entirely feel. Nell saw him from the window of the B-40 car. She knew who it was before he was close enough to see his face. Something in the posture, something in the particular way he held himself as if the world were a balance sheet and he was perpetually checking the columns. Harlan Crest. In person. Alone. Which meant things had gotten bad enough that the lawyers weren't working anymore. She set down her coffee, picked up her father's hammer from the desk, not as a weapon. She just needed something true in her hand. She went to the door and waited. He rode up to the car and stopped and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. The charred section of the south wall. The new windows cut into the iron sides. The pine smoke coming from the small chimney. The B-40, which had been a sealed tomb and a symbol of abandonment for 30 years now, clearly and unmistakably a place where someone lived and worked. Something moved across his face, brief, gone before it fully arrived. Then he looked at Nell. He had aged. She noticed that first. 48 days since she'd left Crest's Hollow, which was not long enough for a man to age visibly. And yet, the gray eyes were the same. The posture was the same. But there was something underneath both of them that had not been there before. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like a man who had not been sleeping well. Good. He dismounted, tied the horse to the iron handrail at the car's end, turned to face her. Nell, he said. Harlan, she said, not uncle. She had decided that sometime in the last 48 days. She wasn't certain exactly when, but she was certain of it now. He looked at the car, then at her. "You've made yourself at home," he said. "I've made a home," she said. "There's a difference." A beat. He looked at the hammer in her hand. "Is that John's?" he said, quietly. "It is." He looked at it for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Then he looked away. At the valley, the mountains, the pale Wyoming sky above everything. "I'd like to come inside," he said. She considered it. "You can," she said, "but I'll ask you to sit across the desk, not beside it." He nodded, came up the 2 steps, ducked slightly to clear the doorframe. He looked around the interior. The desk, the stove, the stacked receipts, the ledger lying open. He looked at it the way you look at a thing you've been dreading seeing for a very long time and have finally run out of ways to avoid. He sat in the chair across the desk. Nell sat behind it. She put the hammer on the desk between them. He looked at it again. "He taught you well," Harlan said. "John?" "He taught me everything worth knowing," she said. "Yes?" Something in his voice, dry and without comfort. "He would have." Silence. She waited. She had learned in 48 days of sitting across tables from people who needed to say difficult things that the best thing you could do was make room for the difficulty and let it come out in its own time. Rushing it never helped. People said what they were ready to say, not before. Harlan looked at his hands, folded in his lap, the hands of a man who had spent his life with paper rather than iron. "Prewitt told me you refused," he said. "I did." "The fire." He stopped, started again. "The fire was not something I ordered." She looked at him. "Prewitt acted independently," Harlan said. "I want you to know that. I am not saying it to protect myself. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you deserve the truth." He paused. "I told him to make the offer. I told him to make it generously. I told him specifically that nothing was to happen to you or your property. Another stop. He made his own assessment of the situation." "Where is Prewitt now?" she said. "No longer in my employ." She absorbed that. "The offer still stands," Harlan said. "If you want it, the money, a clean end to this." "No," she said. He nodded, as if he'd known, as if he'd ridden out here not expecting the answer to change but needing to ask anyway. The silence between them changed texture, became something different, less adversarial, more like the silence of 2 people who have been carrying the same heavy thing from opposite sides and have finally exhaustingly set it down in the same place. "Why did you come?" she said, "if not to make the offer again?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I have been trying to understand," he said slowly, "how we arrived here, you and I, in this particular place." He looked at the ledger. "I have been doing a great deal of accounting recently, not the kind I'm accustomed to." She didn't speak. "I knew your father was in that ledger," he said, just like that, out loud. The thing she had suspected and not yet had confirmed. "I've known since 1855, he said. "I knew the names of every man on that crew. I helped design the payment structure. That was my job." He said the word job the way you say a word that used to mean something and has slowly stopped. "John was brought on for the sulfur bin section specifically. I arranged it. He needed the work. The forge in Harwick wasn't bringing in enough. I knew he needed the work." Nell looked at him. "You arranged for your brother to work the job whose payroll you were planning to steal." "I didn't know at that point what I was planning." His voice was flat, but not the flat of a man who feels nothing. The flat of a man who has been through this argument with himself many times and has stopped expecting it to come out differently. "Or I knew, and I didn't let myself know that I knew. There is a version of it that is better and a version that is worse, and the truth is somewhere between them, and I have never been able to get it exactly right." She stared at him. He looked back at her. "When it was done," he said, "when the car was sealed and Merritt was when it was over. I went through the manifest. I saw his name, $210. He stopped, breathed. "I told myself it would work out, that I would find a way to pay him later. From the profits, from the land sales. I told myself I would make it right eventually." "But you didn't," Nell said. "No, because there was always a reason not to." "Because there was always a reason not to," he agreed, so quiet, She looked at him. This man, her father's brother, the architect of the thing she'd spent 48 days dismantling piece by piece. And what she felt was not what she had expected to feel. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something more complicated and more difficult. Because here was the thing about Harlan Crest that no amount of righteous anger could quite erase. He was a person. He was a person who had made a choice and then another, each one smaller and more manageable seeming than the last, until he was standing at the bottom of a very deep hole he had dug one careful step at a time. And he had looked at his brother's name at the bottom of that hole and told himself he would fix it later. Later never came. Because it never does. That's the thing about later. It is always one more decision away. She understood something then that she couldn't have understood before she came to Sulphur Bend. Before August Merritt's ledger. Before Clara Hess sitting down on her own porch step. She understood that Harlan's crime was not just greed. It was cowardice of a particular and corrosive kind. The cowardice of the man who knows he is doing wrong and decides that knowing is sufficient. That awareness is the same as action. That feeling bad about something exempts you from the obligation to do something about it. Her father had never been that kind of man. John Voss had been many things, not rich, not ambitious in the way Harlan meant ambition, not strategic. But he had not been that kind of man. She felt unexpectedly a fierce and private gratitude for who her father had been. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Coming here. Saying this. Harlan looked at his hands again. "I don't know," he said. It sounded like the truest thing he had said yet. "I'm not sure I want anything. I think I needed—" He stopped, started again. "I needed to say it to someone who had the right to hear it, rather than a lawyer or a mirror." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached into the desk drawer, took out a folded piece of paper, set it on the desk between them. He looked at it. The invoice. His invoice. The one from his office in Crest's Hollow, 4 years of her maintenance itemized to the penny. She had taken it off his desk that morning in March. He hadn't noticed her pick it up. Or if he hadn't thought it mattered, and she had carried it with her since. Folded in her trunk, moving west. "I never signed this," she said. He looked at it. "I never owed you anything." She kept her voice level, even. The same voice she had used that morning in his office 4 months ago. The voice that did not shake. "And you knew that. You knew you were not owed anything by me. You knew what my father built for you, what he was never paid for. And you wrote me an invoice for the cost of my shoes." He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She left the invoice on the desk. "I think you should go now," she said. "I have work to finish." He stood, slowly. The movement of a man for whom standing up had become an effortful thing. He looked at the ledger one more time, at the receipts, at the hammer. He looked at Nell. "I am sorry," he said. "I know that is not sufficient." "No," she said. "It isn't." He went to the door, paused at the threshold with his back to her. "The town," he said. "Crest's Hollow. I built it on what I took from those men. I've been aware of that. Every year, every brick." A pause. "I don't expect you to care about that. He stopped. "I just wanted someone to know that I knew." He stepped out, down the 2 steps, untied his horse. She watched from the door as he rode back down the valley road in the morning light, the straight-backed posture, getting smaller, the pale dust rising behind the horse's hooves. She watched until she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went back to the desk, picked up her father's hammer, held it for a moment. "Everything has a grain. You find it. Then you work with it." She set the hammer down and opened the ledger to the last unclosed entry. John Voss, blacksmith grade 2, wages owed $210. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she stood up, put her jacket on, and went to find Agnes and Clem. What happened to Harlan Crest did not happen dramatically. There was no arrest, no public trial, no moment of formal humiliation in a courtroom. Those things required institutions that were willing and able to take on a man with 30 years of land deeds and legal relationships and a reputation carefully built and thoroughly maintained. But there were other forces, quieter ones, more patient. The receipts had been accumulating for 51 days, 29 families, each one signed and witnessed. each one representing a conversation that had taken place, a story that had been told, a truth that had been heard and acknowledged and written down by the people it concerned. 29 families is not a large number, but those 29 families talked to other people, and the story they told was specific. It had names, it had dates, it had a dead man's handwriting, it had the particular authority that comes from a thing being documented rather than merely alleged. The lawyer in Rawlins, the one Agnes had written, received the copy of the ledger and August Merritt's letter and spent 3 weeks going through them. Then he wrote to the territorial court in Cheyenne. Not a lawsuit, just a letter, outlining with careful precision what the documents showed, and inviting the court to note that certain land transfers recorded in 1862 and 1863 appeared to originate with funds that were now documentably not Harlan Crest's to use. Courts move slowly. The letter sat in a file. But creditors don't move slowly. Creditors talk to each other. And when a story starts circulating, specific documented attached to names and dates and a growing stack of signed receipts, creditors begin to recalibrate their assessments. Harlan Crest's bank in Crest Hollow began experiencing what the financial community calls, in its delicate way, a confidence adjustment. Deposits slowed. A major account transferred to a bank in Laramie. Then another. A land deal that had been in negotiation for months quietly fell through. A partner who had been with him for 15 years found upon reflection that his own interest might be better served through independent operation. None of these things happened because of a courtroom. They happen because truth distributed widely enough in specific enough form changes the temperature of a room, changes the calculation, makes certain bets look different. Harlan Crest had spent 30 years being a man whom other men trusted because he presented himself as a man who understood how the world worked. Paper, numbers, legitimate transactions carefully recorded. Now there was a different kind of paper, a different set of numbers, a different set of carefully recorded transactions. And the story those numbers told was not the one he had built his reputation on. He sold the bank in October, quietly, at a price that suggested urgency. He sold the land holdings in November, parcel by parcel. He sold the house in Crest's Hollow, the large quiet house with the beeswax smell and the ledger-lined bookshelves, in December. Moved east, people said, or west. No one was entirely certain, and after a while no one was asking with any particular energy. The town of Crest Hollow did not cease to exist. Towns don't disappear when the person they're named after leaves. They just become places where other people live and do ordinary things. The bank was purchased by a consortium of local merchants who ran it without particular drama. The streets stayed painted. The cattle in the fenced pastures stayed fat. Harlan Crest became in the end the kind of man who had once been important and was now simply absent, which is in its way the most complete kind of defeat available to someone who has spent their entire life arranging to be significant. Nell heard about most of this in pieces. Through Agnes, who maintained her extraordinary network of information through freight haulers and letters and the sheer force of paying attention. Through Clem, who had contacts on the main railroad line from his working days and heard things at the water stops. She processed each piece of news the way she processed most things, methodically, without excessive satisfaction, filed it away and returned to the work in front of her, because there was still work. The 58th day, the last name in the ledger. It had taken this long to find him. A man named Calhoun Greer, distant relative of Clara Hess, it turned out, which Agnes had suspected but taken weeks to confirm, who had moved after the spur closure, and moved again and again, the way some people do when they are running from the particular grief of a place that promised something and didn't deliver. He had ended up in a small town in the eastern part of the territory, running a livery stable, 61 years old. Agnes had written to him 3 weeks ago. He had written back. He would come to Sulphur Bend. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon driving his own wagon, a compact man with a weather-cut face and the careful eyes of someone who has learned to verify things before trusting them. He sat across from Nell at the desk and she showed him the ledger, his grandfather's name, the figure, the careful notation of the work done and the wages owed and never paid. He looked at it for a long time. "My grandfather talked about this until I was 12 years old," he said. Then he stopped. I think he stopped because talking about it hurt more than not talking about it. "He was right," Nell said. "He was owed this. He did the work. The money was stolen by a man who used it to build things that were never his to build. Calhoun Greer looked at her. "You're John Voss's daughter," he said. She went still. He said it with a kind of quiet recognition, as if the name were familiar in a context she hadn't expected. "I knew your father," Calhoun said. "Not well, that summer. He was on the Sulphur Bend detail. We worked adjacent sections for about 3 weeks. He was a good man, serious about his work. He used to—" a small pause, almost a smile. "He used to say that steel doesn't lie, that if you heated it honest, it would tell you everything you needed to know." Nell sat very still. The exact words, the same words, from a man she had never met in a town she had never been to 30 years ago. "He said that to me too," she said, "more times than I could count." "He meant it," Calhoun said simply. "You could tell." She counted out his payment. He signed the receipt. His hand was steady. Before he left, he stood at the door and looked around the car. The desk, the stove, the stacked receipts, the windows cut in the iron walls. "He would have liked knowing you did this," Calhoun said. She didn't trust herself to speak for a moment. "I think he might have," she said. Calhoun Greer drove his wagon back down the valley road as the afternoon light went long and golden across the plain. She watched him go. Then she came back inside, sat at the desk, opened the ledger to the last unclosed entry. John Voss, blacksmith grade 2, wages owed $210. 30 names in the ledger, 29 now paid and receipted and closed, 1 remaining. She had been thinking about this for weeks. What to do with it? How to close it in a way that was right. Not just correct by the numbers, right in the way her father would have understood rightness, which had nothing to do with accounting and everything to do with what a thing was actually for. She could keep it. She had that right, certainly. She was his heir. She had found the ledger. She had done the work. $210 would change her immediate situation considerably. But every time she thought about keeping it, something felt wrong, like a hammer striking off center, like metal heated past its right temperature. The grain of it wasn't there. It wasn't. She thought about August Merritt, dying in this car with his hand on a strongbox, not to protect the gold, to protect the record, the names, the claim of every man who had swung a tool on this ground and was owed something for it. She thought about her father, what he had built, what he had been, the smithy sold, the tools hauled away, the name never spoken in a quiet house for 4 years. And she thought about Sulphur Bend, the school that had closed when the town died, the children who grew up without one, Elspeth's boys running through the sagebrush, Owen Hatch at the forge, a town trying to remember how to be a place. She knew what to do. She had known for a while, probably. She had just been letting herself get there at the right pace. The next morning she told Agnes. Agnes didn't say anything for a moment, just stood in the doorway of the car with her coffee cup and looked at Nell with those dark, considering eyes. "All of it," she said. "All of it," Nell said. "The school fund." The school fund. Enough to rebuild the building, furnish it, and pay a teacher for the first 2 years. Whatever's left over goes into a general account for the town, for things that get needed. Agnes was quiet. "Your father would have done exactly that," she said. "I never met him, but I know that's true." "Yes," Nell said. "I think he would have." She sent word through Agnes's network, a gathering at Sulphur Bend, the following Sunday. Anyone who had received a payment from the ledger and anyone else from the valley who wanted to come. They came. Nell hadn't been certain how many would make the effort, but they came. Clara Hess drove in from Draper Creek with her 2 boys. Rufus Garland rode in from his homestead. The bakery woman from Holt closed her shop for the morning and came. The bootmaker came. 3 families Nell had never met, but who had heard the story and felt the gravitational pull of it. Calhoun Greer came back. He had not gone home. He had stayed in the valley, he said, because he had a feeling the ending was worth watching. 31 people in the yard outside the B-40 car on a Sunday morning in late October. The sky, that deep blue that Wyoming skies get in autumn before the winter closes everything down. The mountains to the west wearing their first snow at the peaks white against the blue like something painted on. Owen Hatch had built a fire in the yard. It was cold enough to justify it and warm enough to gather around. Nell stood in the doorway of the car with the ledger in her hands. She looked at them. These people. Some of them she knew well now, Agnes, Clem, Clara, Owen. Some she had met only once briefly in the particular intimacy of handing someone a canvas bag and watching them understand that something long owed had been returned. Some she was seeing for the first time today. But all of them were here because of August Merritt's careful handwriting. Because a man had chosen to die in the truth rather than live in a lie. Because his records had been precise enough and specific enough and honest enough to reach across 30 years and 30 miles and find every one of them. She opened the ledger to the last page. "My name is Nell Voss," she said. Her voice carried in the cold air without effort. "My father was John Voss. He worked the Sulphur Bend spur construction in the summer of 1855. He was a blacksmith. He was owed $210 for that work. He never received it. He died not knowing it was still owed." Silence. The fire crackling. "Every other name in this ledger has been paid," she said. "Every other family has received what was owed to them. There is one entry left. This one." She held up the ledger open to the page. "I am the last heir, and I have decided what should be done with it." She looked out at them. "This town had a school," she said. "It closed when Sulphur Bend died. The children who grew up here after that grew up without one. The children growing up here now." She looked at Clara Hess's boys standing beside their mother, watching her with the particular attention children give to things they sense are important. "Are growing up without one." She reached into her jacket and took out the canvas bag. The last one. Counted out with the same precision she had applied to every other payment. $210 plus 30 years of interest. "This is my father's wages," she said, "and I'm giving it to Sulphur Bend, to build the school back. Because he built this line, and he was never paid. So let this be what he built instead." She set the bag on the makeshift table Clem had set up in the yard. For a moment, nothing happened. The fire popped. The wind moved through the sage. Then Clara Hess stepped forward. She put her hand on the bag, not taking it, just acknowledging it. "My grandfather would have wanted to be here for this," she said quietly. "He would have liked meeting your father, I think." "I think they would have gotten along," Nell said. More people came forward, not to the bag, just forward, closing the space between themselves and the fire and each other, the way people do when they are becoming or remembering that they already are a community. Clem came to stand beside Nell. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his bent back and his gnarled hands and his pale eyes that had seen the spur line built and watched it die, and were now apparently watching something come back. Agnes was on her other side. Owen Hatch across the fire caught Nell's eye. He nodded once, the way men who work with their hands nod when something is done right. She recognized it. She had seen it before, from another man, in another yard, a long time ago and not so long ago. The gathering lasted most of the morning. People talked about the school who could teach what it would need, who had children that age, who remembered what the building had been like. Practical questions. The questions of people who have decided something is going to happen and are working out how. By noon it had taken a shape. Clara Hess had a cousin in Rollins who had been a school teacher before her children were born. Agnes knew a carpenter in Holt who could be hired. Rufus Garland had lumber he could contribute. A man named Prescott Daly, whom Nell had not previously met, said he had stone for the foundation. He'd been pulling it out of his east field for 3 years and had nowhere to put it. Prescott Daly. Not in the ledger, not owed anything by August Merritt's accounting. Just a man with a field full of stones and a sense that things should be built, that Nell thought was also the grain of it. The afternoon came and the gathering dispersed. Wagons heading back down various roads, children running a last circuit around the yard before being collected. Handshakes and nods and the comfortable shorthand of people who now share something. Clara Hess was the last to go. She came to Nell before she left and stood for a moment without speaking, which with Clara Hess meant she was working out how to say something exactly right. "My grandmother believed all her life that the wrong would be righted someday," she said. "She didn't know how. She just believed it would be." She looked at Nell. "I used to think that was just something people told themselves to get through." A pause. "I don't think that anymore." She got in her wagon. Her boys were already up and settled the younger one asleep against the older one's shoulder. Nell watched them go. Then she turned and went inside. The ledger was on the desk. She sat down and opened it to the first page. The beginning. August Merritt's careful title entry. The ink faded but still clear. Wyoming and Pacific Railroad. Payroll manifest and transaction record. August 1855. She turned through the pages slowly. All 30 names. Every entry. 30 payments made. 30 receipts signed. 30 families told the truth of what had been done to them and given back what had been taken. And one last name. John Voss. She ran her finger across it. The way you touch something you are about to put down for the last time, not sadly, with the particular care you give to things that have weight. She took the pen from the desk, dipped it, wrote next to her father's entry in her own hand in the same careful style that August Merritt had used for 30 pages before her settled, Sulphur Bend School Fund, October 1885. She set the pen down. The ledger was complete. She held it for a moment. This thing that August Merritt had written in the dark with his hand on a strongbox and the air going thin around him. This record of names and numbers and honest work and wages owed. This instrument of truth that he had decided mattered enough to die for. She closed it, set it on the desk. Then she picked up her father's hammer. The cross peen with the hickory handle dark and smooth and exactly the right weight in her hand. She held it the way he had taught her at the base of the fingers, feeling the balance. She took it outside. Owen was still at the forge. She could hear him before she could see him. The ring of iron on iron, clean and rhythmic the way it had rung for 3 weeks now across this valley. The sound of a place that was learning slowly to be a place again. She stood in the yard and listened. The valley lay in the long afternoon light, the mountains to the west catching the last of the sun on their snow-covered peaks, the sage moving in the cold wind, the sky that deep, improbable blue. This was what $4 had built. Not the gold that was Merritt's work tended faithfully for 30 years. Not even the ledger that was Merritt's work too. What $4 had built was the opening. The act of asking. The small raised hand of a girl with $6 left who decided that owning something mattered even if what she owned was a locked iron box that nobody wanted on a dead-end track in the middle of nowhere. She hadn't known what was inside. She had just known that she needed something to be hers. And it turned out that the thing that became hers was not the gold or the ledger or the chance to see her uncle reduced to a man selling his house quietly in December. What became hers was this: the valley, the fire in Owen's forge, the school that would be built from her father's wages, the 30 families who had been given back something they hadn't known they were still owed, and the knowledge solid and unshakable now the way tempered steel is solid that she was John Voss's daughter. That she had worked with the grain of things rather than against them, that she had found the truth in the same place her father had always told her to look for it, in honest work, done right, without rushing the last step. She walked toward the sound of the forge. Owen looked up when she came in, the firelight on his face, the anvil between them. She set her father's hammer on the anvil. He looked at it, then at her. "Show me what you're working on," she said. He showed her. She picked up the hammer, felt the familiar pull of it against her palm, and she went to work.